When we were newborn, we viewed the world as a singular field of awareness. Nobody sees a newborn baby and says, oh, it's pretty cute, but it will be better once it's enlightened.
Awareness, the final frontier. This is Awareness Explorers.
Welcome back, fellow explorers, to Awareness Explorers. I'm your co-host, Jonathan Robinson, and with my friend and co-host,
Brian Tom O'Connor.
And we have a guest explorer today named David Farmer. And as usual, Brian knows a lot about him and I know nothing, so I can ask all the relevant questions in the beginning. But a little bit about David, just so you know. In 2003, he went to Japan, and in Japan, he gravitated away from his background in music and started the spiritual path, where in order to help deal with depression and excessive drinking, which he'd been struggling with on and off for years, he practiced Zen meditation and Japanese archery, and informally studied Buddhism, Shintoism, and Taoism, all while teaching English in schools. In 2021, upon recognizing his true nature, David and his adventures in Japan, he drew that to a close and he returned to his native Scotland to start a new chapter as a non-dual guide and personal coach, supporting others with their own spiritual, mental, emotional, and addiction and well-being issues. Welcome to Awareness Explorers, David.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. Nice to meet you both, Jonathan and Brian.
So I'm curious, you spent this time in Japan, which is obviously a very different culture spiritually and in every way than Scotland. What got you to go to Japan versus, say, some other place or some retreats or whatever?
Yeah, it was an interesting part of my life, an interesting chapter. It was actually, I call Japan the second chapter of my life. The first chapter was my life as a professional musician, and which I spent mostly in London. So I studied music at the Royal Academy of Music in London, and I worked as a professional classical musician for years there. There was always a sort of an Asian flavor, if you like, to my life, even before then. One of my father's good friends was a collector of Japanese artifacts, a sort of an armchair expert on, antiques and things and swords and all that sort of stuff. He had a room in his house which was full of, Aladdin's cave of, bits and bobs from Japan. And when I moved to London, I left a very small little village in Scotland to move down to London when I was 18. So I was very much like the country boy in the big city, and it was quite stressful, I guess, in the beginning would be the right word. But I gravitated towards the Japanese students there. They were very kind and very welcoming, and I sort of became part of their little clique at the academy. And I also met other people from Vietnam and China and whatnot. So I don't know, I just felt naturally very comfortable with people from Asia. And so then after graduating from the Royal Academy, and I started working as a musician for a while, and then I was starting to really not enjoy London life, and I was starting to drink a little bit too much. I was starting to get a bit depressed, and there was this feeling of a need for a change. And it was really then that I had this one day, this sort of epiphany, like, okay, you know what? I'm going to move to Japan, And I'd just been making a CD around that time, and it was going to be released around the world, and it was going to be released in Tokyo. So the producers set me up to go there for a week to play a little concert in Tower Records in Shibuya in Tokyo, and a little signing event and things. And so I'd said to myself, right, if I really enjoy it, then I'm going to move. And so I went there, and of course I loved it. And I thought, right, this is it. So I came back to London and for 9 months, and then I moved sort of over to Japan. But April 2003.
And, Japan obviously has a very different spiritual outlook than the West. And I'm wondering what enticed you there, what you noticed was different and how that became part of your life.
Yeah, it's difficult to pinpoint a sort of any kind of real event or any kind of conscious interest in one specific area of spirituality at that point when I first moved. But looking back, I can see that there was an element there of wanting to find myself, which is funny now because we don't need to go anywhere to find ourselves. You already are yourself. But there was this element, I think, of wanting to go and search for myself. And I was just drawn to that, like a lot of people in the West, when we start to ask or feel drawn to spirituality, we tend to look east, and many people were drawn to India. In my case, it was Japan. But it was really, about 3 years into my stay in Japan, 2006, when my father passed away in Scotland. So I had to fly back to Scotland to, deal with all of that. And then I had to go back to Japan again by myself. And it was then that the sort of the seeking started. It was the whole, why are we here? What's the point? What is all of this? And that's where the seeking really started for me. So initially I was drawn to meditation and Zen, although I didn't go to a monastery in Japan, although I could have done. I've never been really into sort of doing things in big groups. But, if you want to find a temple in Japan, it's really easy. There's one down every street almost. So there was that influence was there. So I actually became friends with a monk who I was teaching English to at one point, and he told me where I could buy, a zafu, the meditation cushions the monks use. So I went to a place and I got one for myself, and I used to meditate in my flat, in my apartment. And I was also drawn to do some. I needed something because my father had gone, and that was a kind of a big, upheaval in the whole family's life, but particularly in my own. I felt I needed some discipline, and I felt I was starting to drink too much, and I was starting to lose my bearings a bit. And so the opportunity came to study Japanese archery. It was really fantastic because archery was something I used to do with my dad when I was back in my early teens. But to study Japanese traditional archery, which was heavily influenced by Zen, that was a real great opportunity. So I went to one of the big dojos in Tokyo, and I started practicing Kyudo, as it's known, the way of the bow. And that was really the beginning of the seeking and the searching. So I was doing the Kyudo for about 5-6 years and meditating by myself, and then reading voraciously. There's a very big bookshop in Tokyo called Kinokuniya, and they had a very, very big foreign book section. So I was delving in there to the philosophy and Zen and Buddhism sections almost every week. So that was really
as a Westerner, it's hard to see how, and this is my lack of my ignorance, but it's hard to see how archery ends up being a spiritual path and how that's connected to our true nature. I'm sure there is a way, and you're studying it for many years, and yet it's not something where anybody in America that I know of is studying archery as a spiritual path. So I'm wondering if you can maybe mention how they're connected.
So Japanese traditional archery is very, very, on the face of it, very simple. It uses a traditional long bow, an asymmetrical bow, which is very, very long. And you shoot only 2 arrows. The distance from you to the target doesn't change. It's always the same. I think it's 25 meters. The size of the target doesn't change at all. So there are no sights on the bow. There's no fancy, stabilizers and mechanisms and fancy releases and all that kind of stuff. There's really only you and the bow and the target. And so to compare it to a Western activity, is if you take golf, for example, and let's say golf, there are many more variables, but let's say you have only like a par 3, you have only 1 club, and that is, let's say that's the totality of golf, just a par 3, same distance, 1 club, and you have to get the ball in the hole. Now, what does that what does that reduce everything down to? That reduces everything down to you, your technique, and your mental state.
Mm-hmm.
So because there are no other variables, in golf there might be some wind, but in archery, 25 meters, the wind doesn't affect it. So if you miss the target, you only have yourself to blame. So you're looking at yourself, what do I need to change? And in the beginning, it's a lot of physical things, is my stance correct, And there's the same as in archery, same in golf, your swing is more or less, you try and keep it the same all the time. Your stance has to be the same, your grip is the same, more or less. In Japanese archery, it's the same thing. Your grip on the bow is always the same. The way you hold the string is always the same, and the way that you draw the bow is always the same. So if you then miss the target, well, you've only got yourself to blame, and you have to look at yourself to see what to change. So as I say, it could be physical things in the beginning. Maybe you're tugging the string, maybe you're releasing in a strange way. But as your techniques get more and more refined, what you find is that it becomes much more of a mental thing.
It's fascinating. It's kind of like what I hear you say, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that where the arrow goes is almost like a outward symbol of your mental state in that moment that you shot it.
Correct. And an interesting, that's correct. And the other interesting thing about archery is that, well, there's two things I really want to point out. One is that we only ever shoot 2 arrows. And what happens is, especially when you start doing examinations there, is that you need both arrows to hit the target to pass the examinations as you get further up the ranks. And so you'll find that, and again, golfers will relate to this, if you hit the target with your first arrow, there's a little bit of a, woo, I hit the target comes up.
Woohoo!
And then what happens? You've lost your concentration and you may miss the target with your second arrow and therefore fail. On the other hand, you may miss with your first arrow and then an element of frustration comes in. And because that tension has come into the body, you then miss with the second arrow as well, 9 times out of 10. So you can see how you start to need to then control your emotions and things start to go deeper and deeper. And the other thing to go one step further is the way the arrow is released is very important and this ties into what we'll perhaps be talking about throughout this conversation, which is effortless being an effortless flow state. Because in the Japanese language, they make a very big difference between transitive and intransitive verbs. And so in Japanese, there's 2 ways to say that something is released, as in a bow is released. One is hanareru, and the other one is hanasu. So hanasu means that you have released the string by yourself. Hanareru means that the string released by itself. So when you're in the state of full draw, if there's a thought comes into your head and you think, right, now, pum, the teacher would scold you. The teacher would tell you off and he would say, like, you released it. And what he's trying to point to is that there needs to be a natural release. In other words, you come to the state of full draw and there's an expansion not only of your body, but of your spiritual energy, your ki in Japanese, chi in Chinese. And so this energy is expanding and it keeps expanding and keeps expanding. And then without you knowing, oh, the arrow goes. And that's the state that we're looking for, that effortless release of the arrow. It's often compared to, they use the analogy of the snow falling off a leaf. So if you imagine snow building up on a leaf, and then just, we never know when it's going to be, but when the weight gets too much, it comes off. So that's how we then get into this sort of spiritual side of the archery, where you want to get into a state of, in Zen, they would say no mind or mushin, where you're in full draw and there are no thoughts present. There's just this effortless expansion of body and energy, and the arrow goes by itself. And to get to that, obviously, that's easier said than done. And then that's where you have to start, you're wrestling with your thoughts and all the rest of it, So that's how it gets to be from archery to a spiritual pursuit, if you like.
That's beautifully described. Thanks. And I can imagine that being applied to so many, because the two elements that you talked about, the in between the first and second arrow, you're either thinking about the past or thinking about the future and then letting that go. And then the effortlessness of it seems
Correct.
to be, it could apply to so many things in life, including like having a podcast.
Correct. It was what you found was, as you've just said really nicely there, Brian, that you, of course, you're forced into the present moment. You're not thinking about, oh, I hit the target. You're not thinking about the arrow that hit the target when you're preparing the next one. Then you're not in the present moment. Or likewise, you're thinking about the next arrow, or all the rest of it. So you're kind of forced into that present moment. But really, the dojo is a mini version of the outside world. That's what they tried to replicate there. It's a and you did find that the more you were in the dojo, that the more you realized that everything that you were understanding that you could was then applied to the rest of your life as well. So yeah, absolutely correct.
I was struck by your description. It sounded a lot like Luke feeling the Force in Star Wars and knowing when to shoot the Death Star.
Yeah. Well, he got a lot of that from, George Lucas got a lot of that from Zen and the character of Yoda as the sort of a Zen master,
Yeah.
and that he got a lot of that in the samurai element of the lightsabers and all the rest of it. So yeah, it's funny how I've now I'm much older and I look back at that movie and I look at it in a brand new light.
Yeah. I have a friend who spent 12 years in Japan learning the Japanese tea ceremony.
Yes.
Which, as a not so bright Westerner as me, thinks, well, that seems like that would be a good course for an hour. So there's a lot that I'm missing in this in terms of subtlety. And I like how in Japan, they have, many years of archery, many years of tea ceremonies. It's a very different culture that way. And I'm wondering if the culture somehow, how that infused you into your work that you're doing now.
Yeah, I mean, it was really, I just immersed myself in that side of it, as a lot of Westerners do, most Japanese are not interested in traditional Japanese archery, Zen, or tea ceremony, or any of that, But Westerners go there. It's like, a lot of people go to India to study yoga. Most Indians are not interested in yoga when you get there, So, but yeah, if you're drawn to that, it's available, and I was particularly drawn to that, and yeah, it was a lot of I had a lot of good times working and practicing archery in the dojo, and as I say, I coupled that with meditation and also a lot of study. The seeking stage for me involved a lot of reading and studying, and because I could, as I said, I could pick up books easily, and then I could relate it to what I was seeing, and go to temples. And I lived in Kamakura, which is for us a short while, which is one of the old capitals, and it has a lot of Rinzai Zen temples. My monk friend was Soto Zen sect monk, and so I learned a lot from him. And yeah, you were just immersed in that, but it was mainly sort of through the reading and the meditation, all that combined, that through that whole seeking phase, there was moments where there was aha moments along the way, when you read something or something clicked with you. But it wasn't really until years later, if I started seeking 2006, it wasn't until 2021 where there was this awakening, and I recognized my true nature. And that was interestingly nothing to do with anything Japanese whatsoever. In fact, it was a very nice English man called David Bingham, who I heard talking about consciousness on a YouTube video one day when I was sitting in my flat in Yokohama. And it was hearing his words that actually resulted in my spontaneous awakening. So it was kind of funny how, after all the deep Japanese and Zen things I did, it was not that didn't have a part to play, I'm sure, but it was an English man that sparked the awakening.
That's absolutely fascinating. And you know, I've heard many people report that about listening to David Bingham's
Yes.
YouTube videos. And as a matter of fact, you know, your website, Effortless Being, is which when I reached out to you, I thought that was just such a perfect term to encapsulate non-duality and the knowing of our true nature. But it's also the title of David Bingham's book.
Right. So it was David that suggested the title for my website.
I see. Great. So you didn't just watch YouTube videos, you reached out to him and started.
Yeah. So what happened was it was February 2021. And I'd just gone through a phase. I'd broken up with my partner at the time. She'd left. I was living by myself again, and gone through a bit of a rough time. And I had just made some dinner one night, and I thought, oh, I need to watch something during dinner time. What am I going to watch? So I went on Netflix, and there was the documentary for The Secret by Rhonda Byrne. And so I watched that and I thought, oh, okay, that's interesting, you know, positive thinking and manifestation, all that kind of thing. Okay. And then after I watched it, I read a little bit about Rhonda Byrne, and it was just at the time when she just released her book, The Greatest Secret. And she had been talking online about how she recognized her true nature by talking to David Bingham. And so I went on YouTube and I saw that David had done a few conscious TV interviews, so, you know, a good few years ago now. So I just picked one at random and just thought I'll just listen to this while I'm meeting. And I thought, you know, there'd be some formalities at the beginning. So I scrolled past that a little bit and then I just hit play. And the first thing I heard him say was, truth is very simple. It's simply infinite consciousness having a human experience. And that was it for me. There was just this kind of, oh, you know, and that was it. It was as simple as that. And so I reached out to him just to say thank you, actually, you know, which just seems like an absurd thing to do. But yeah, I reached out to him and sent him an email. I just said, you know, thank you very much, and kindly replied. And then about a month later, you know, I was my job was changing, and then I spent, you know, after this self-realization, it was a month of complete bliss. You know, I was just blissed out. I was just staring at the clouds and the flowers and all this kind of stuff. But then I had to go. My job changed, and I had to go back to this, you know, this IT company I was working at in Tokyo, and my role had changed, and I was finding it like I was a bit discombobulated, to use a very English word. And so I reached out to David and just said, you know, is there any advice you can give me to sort of integrate what's going on here? And he said, oh, let's have a chat. So we had a chat. As I say, I was still in Japan at that time. And it was great. It was great to talk to him, and he gave me, you know, a lot of advice, and you know, we've become quite good friends. And it was really just about a month or so after that, I decided that it was time to move back to Scotland. You know, I remember sitting on my balcony in Yokohama one day and just thinking, you know, well, that's enough. You know, I don't know, I felt like I couldn't achieve anything else in Japan, and that was the end of it. So after 18 and a half years there, I just upped sticks, packed my bags, and within 3 months I had moved back to Scotland and living with my mum again. So, but now when I was back in Scotland, I got back in touch with David again, and that was when, you know, we actually were able to meet. We met for lunch one day, and along with another friend, and talked a lot. And yeah, during that time in summer of 2021, I had the idea to, you know, start a website, and I was trying to think of what to call it. And I sent David about 4 or 5 ideas, and he said, oh, I think probably, you know, Effortless Being is the best one out of that list. So that's how effortlessbeing.org.
Beautiful.
I'm curious, David, you know, it's interesting to me when people say they have this spontaneous awakening. In this case, you heard David talk for a minute and something explodes. What would you say changed, and why do you think it stayed around as opposed to just being a 1 minute experience?
Yeah, well, I think there's a couple of things to unpack there with what you said, Jonathan. And the first one is, and I want to be really clear about this because I know there's a lot of people listening, that it's self-realization is not an experience. The mind desires experiences. And so long as we are attracted and we are consumed and interested in the contents of the mind, then we'll constantly desire experience. And this is one of the reasons why seekers get stuck seeking for years and years and years, because they believe that is enlightenment or awakening is the experience beyond all experiences. But it's really not an experience at all. It's just simply the clear seeing of your true nature. And in that moment of clear seeing of your true nature, you also immediately recognize what is false. And in this case, the false belief in a separate self, in being a person. And the closest way I can point to, because it's impossible, there's nothing that I can do to make somebody, realize their true nature. Consciousness reveals itself in its own way, its own timing. It doesn't have to be after years of seeking. There are many people who've recognized their true nature and thought, what the hell's happened? And then started seeking to try to find out and reading. Eckhart Tolle is a good example of that. He had an awakening and then he was reading up to find out what happened to him. So, we never know when consciousness will reveal itself. In my case, it was after 15 years of seeking. But the one thing, and the reason it sticks and stays around, is because it's not an experience. And I'll give you an analogy to, and this is the closest I can point to self-realization without people, having self-realization. It's really like realizing there's no Santa Claus. So I don't know about you guys, but in my case, up until about 10 or 11 years old, I was led to believe there was a Santa Claus, and I believed it, right? And, no reason to believe otherwise. That's what I was told. Santa Claus exists, and he delivers presents down the chimney, and on Christmas Eve, and you get them in the morning. Fantastic. Okay. And then when I was about, it was traditional in Scotland, I think in other parts of the world, that on Christmas Eve you would leave out, a drink and something for, drink for Santa and something for the reindeer. And so I used to leave a glass of milk and a biscuit on the mantelpiece above the fire every year. And I remember one Christmas Eve, I put the milk up on the mantelpiece, I put the biscuit up. And I remember my dad said, actually, Santa prefers whiskey. And in that moment, I just went, oh, okay. And I got it. Oh, it was my parents all along. Okay. Now, what happened there? Was that an experience? No. It was a false belief that, like a bubble burst. So there was this recognition, this knowing of the truth of the matter. And in this case, there was no Santa Claus, and there never had been. It was just a thought that I believed. And then a secondary realization comes in, which is, for me, the bubble is burst and there's no going back. So no matter how many people tell me there's Santa Claus, no matter how much it's perpetuated by society, for me, there's no going back. I know there's no Santa Claus. Now, that doesn't mean I can't pretend there is, for the sake of some kind of societal circumstance I find myself in. my niece recently has found out there's no Santa Claus, but my nephew still believes. So when I'm still with my nephew, you know, I can pretend that there's a Santa Claus. I can pretend. And that is really self-realization. It's the popping of the bubble. It's that we held on to this belief of being a separate self, but we never were. It was just a thought that was believed. But when that's burst, and that's seen through, and there's that clear seeing of our true nature, then there's no going back. But we can pretend for the sake of, you know, if the Amazon delivery guy comes to my door and says, "Hey, are you David Farmer?" I say, "Yeah, I'm David Farmer. Yeah. Thanks for my parcel," you know. And then I can go back to just being, you know, just remaining as an effortless being. But I think that's the best, closest way I can really sort of give an analogy to it. So, and you can see through that it's not an experience at all. And the fact that seekers seek experience keeps them away from the recognition of their true nature.
It's a great answer.
Yeah, it's beautifully described. And I thought you did very well, especially considering that in one of your most recent videos that I watched, you said that you had a love-hate relationship with talking about our true nature. I really could relate to that a lot, because words can point to it, but they always seem to fall short, even as beautifully as you just described that.
Yeah, there's always a concession when we use words, because words are just verbalized thoughts, and there's always that slight concession when we're trying to describe things in words. And as I said in that video you're referring to, you know, it's that eternal struggle of the poet trying to describe in words that which cannot be expressed in words. So it's always a kind of a funny struggle there, and sometimes you feel it goes better than others, but it is what it is. You know, you just so long as we, you know, humanity is using words to communicate at the moment. So, you know, so long as we are in this situation, one does one's best. But yeah, it's something that is beyond words, and even, you know, that's why I always say, you know, that it's beyond even non-duality what we're talking about here. You know, that it's beyond both duality and non-duality. We use non-duality because, you know, there's this belief in duality. You know, duality doesn't actually exist. But for those that have this feeling that there is a dualistic existence, then we can use the teachings of non-duality to point to this oneness. But it's very much like a thorn used to release a thorn, you know, then when you can discard both. And there you are, and that this isness is that which cannot be described in words.
I'm curious, when you had this realization, you know, being that you had a history of some depression and other things, how did it, even though it's not an experience, it's a realization, how did it change your day-to-day experience?
Yeah, it's well, we start to become into alignment with this true nature. You know, all the troubles that we're really people are going through are because of this misunderstanding. You know, it's just this case of mistaken identity, that you believe yourself to be a separate person, and because of that mistaken belief, then it really causes all the trouble and strife that people experience. So all of that is when the separate self, when you see through that illusion of the separate self, then things start to work their way out, work themselves out, you know. Now that doesn't happen overnight, and this is something which is really interesting. It's starting to be discussed a lot more now. It's like post awakening, if you like. You know, is it suddenly all unicorns and rainbows? Well, no, because there's a bit of your stuff, because everybody's got their stuff that they need to work out, you know. Your stuff still needs to be worked out, but it's worked out in a much quicker and healthier way, because you're just coming into alignment with truth. And so all the stuff that you've sort of buried and not looked at over the years, that will come out. But because you now have this awareness, then it's seen and it's allowed to dissipate, you know. It's like if you're standing up against a tree, if you've got your nose starts, pressed up against a tree, you don't even recognize it as a tree, you know. You're just, it's only till you stand back and get a bit of perspective that you recognize there's a tree. And then stand back a bit more, you see, oh, there's a forest, and a bit more, It's like where you are, Brian. If you go up to the top of a big skyscraper, it's only when you get up to the top you get that perspective. You're like, oh, that's how it is. All right, okay, cool. And then you can come back down and you can integrate yourself back into the world again. But you've had that perspective, and that never disappears. And it may seem to be covered over because of life circumstances, but because you have that newfound perspective of infinite consciousness, infinite awareness, then whenever things come up, whether it be some past trauma or some issue or some trigger or whatever, it comes up, and then you see it and it dissipates, And there may be some issues with that. Some people have it easier than others. And there's no set way that it goes. Awakening is different for everyone. But certainly, that the trick is not to identify with whatever is coming up, and just allow it to come up and be seen and dissipate,
And that, I assume, includes strong emotions that may have been suppressed up until now, that appear, because many people have an idea that if I am spiritual or if I am awakened, I'm not going to have so-called negative emotions. And then it's, back to the old game of suppressing. So
that's right.
Go through experiences where you really just had to allow the emotions to be.
Well, you become more authentic, Brian, because you just become, everything's allowed to be 100%. There's no like, oh, I shouldn't be angry because of blah de blah, or I shouldn't be frustrated because I'm a spiritual seeker, and spiritual seekers never get angry or frustrated. They sit like this all day long and be blissful. It's there's all that crap goes, and you just become 100% authentic, with whatever it is, and allow everything to come up. I kind of likened it to a spinning top. If you like one of these spinning tops that we make when we're kids, we get a disc of paper and we divide it into segments, and we color each segment a different color and stick a pencil through, and we spin it, and it all comes into this sort of, supposed to go white, but according to the science books, but it's always a sort of a gray mush, isn't it? But anyway, you get the idea, it goes into this thing. And what we're doing really, when we identify as a separate person, we're just keeping this top spinning. But when we then when there's self-realization, we really disconnect the energy supply to that, and that momentum starts to slow down. It's really a slowing down of the momentum. It doesn't come to a sudden stop, because we've been pretending to be the separate self for a long time,
Yeah.
So, and when it starts to slow down, if you like, because we're no longer perpetuating, we start to see all the stuff that we ignored before. And that can go deeper, it can be simple thoughts, or it can be as deep as traumas and things, and that the energy of that can be, so dense and so gross that it's stored in the body and the energy of the body, and all of that can start to come out. But when it comes up, because we've got, as I say, that perspective, you see it and you let it go, So it's not, a lot of people criticize this so-called direct path as being spiritual bypassing, and it is spiritual bypassing. We're not, it really absolutely is, but that doesn't mean that you don't have to deal with all your shit. In the end, you still have to deal with all that when it comes up, but it's dealt with from the position of infinite consciousness, not the position of I'm a person and I need to feel my feelings and heal my traumas and all that kind of thing. So a good way of visualizing this, I think this is a good opportune moment to talk about the 5 koshas, because this is something that was taught to me by David Bingham when I was in my sort of slightly discombobulated state a month or two after awakening. And it really helped to stabilize that, and also to help you clearly see the structure of the human experience. So I don't know if you're familiar with the 5 koshas or the 5 bodily sheaths in Indian philosophy. So anybody who studied yoga or that will know about the koshas. The koshas are normally taught in the wrong order. They start with the physical body, and then they'll talk about the emotional body and the mental body. But this is always to take the standpoint of a separate person. There's me, the separate person who needs to be enlightened in some way. So we start to do yoga, do spiritual practices, eat better, be nice. And maybe if we do that, maybe meditate. And if we do that long enough, we'll recognize our true nature, But this causes, a lot of people to be seekers for a very long time because they get stuck in that, because there's the fundamental erroneous belief of being a separate person. So a good way to look at the koshas is from the point of view of what we know for sure. Because being a spiritual seeker implies that you don't know what you are. If you knew what you were, you wouldn't seek. So there are doubts. But people who are seeking will doubt what they are, they'll doubt the world, But there's one thing that we cannot doubt, and that is our own existence. So if you ask yourself, do I exist? Well, the answer is yeah. Nobody doubts their own existence. So from that, if we take that as fundamental, the knowing of your own existence, the one thing nobody doubts, then we can talk about the human experience from that perspective. So if we talk about the 5 koshas from the perspective of knowing our own existence, the first kosha is the body of bliss. So the body of bliss is, as the name suggests, bliss, peace, contentment, unconditional love. The second kosha is the body of wisdom, which is intuition, gut feeling, flow state, effortless being. The third kosha is the mind, the body of mind. So that's thinking and thoughts. Then the fourth kosha is the energy body, the body of energy, which is your emotions. And then the last kosha, the fifth kosha, is the physical body. So when you look at it from this perspective, you can see that, the physical body is actually the least part of what we are. And it's kind of like the fingers coming out of a hand, if you like. If you imagine this is our, our essence, and then we come out body of bliss, body of wisdom, thoughts, emotions, and then the fingernail would be the hard sort of physical body, if you like. So when we look at it like this, we can see that most people are living their entire lives in the body of mind, emotion, and physical body. But when we recognize our true nature as infinite consciousness, we simultaneously recognize that we can choose to step into thinking, or we can remain as effortless being in the body of wisdom. And this is what I was talking about, is this kind of disconnection of energy from thinking. And this will become clearer if we do this meditation towards the end, where we can really go through how to recognize effortless being. But looking at the koshas, you can see how the human experience is structured, and that all the suffering happens within this self-enclosed capsule of thinking, emotion, body. In effortless being, there's no suffering. Effortless being, there's no suffering. In just allowing your heart to beat, allowing your hair to grow, allowing lungs to breathe, there is no suffering in any of that. As soon as thought comes in and says, I don't like this, that's suffering itself. that resistance to what is.
I'm wondering, David,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, and this is very interesting, being that you are a coach now, what do you do when somebody comes to you to help them, say, through the 5 koshas, or help them realize their true nature?
Well, often just pointing that out, just as I've said, often that just pointing that out can be enough. It really depends where everybody is, and that's why I quite like working with people one-on-one. It's really interesting, a lot of my time in Japan, in fact, my whole time I was teaching English there, it was all one-to-one classes, So it's interesting. I've had such a background in teaching, working with people one-on-one. Now this is, we're dealing with spirituality and our true nature, but you can sense where people are, and you can sense what they need to, where their sticking point is. But really, the main sticking point for everybody is this belief in being a separate self, which is being stuck in the body of mind. And then, but pointing them to effortless being and making and helping them remain consciously as effortless being in the body of wisdom, they can then see that there's a disconnection. They can disconnect the energy from mind. And that doesn't mean that everything just goes poof and disappears, as many people fear. Everything's going on perfectly well, actually. In fact, things go on much better if mind gets out of the way. And mind is, our thinking is really just like a commentary, to what's going on. It's like if you're watching a football match on TV, and if you mute the commentators, the match is going on perfectly well, right? And then you can put the commentators on, and you hear them commentating on the match. Now, if there's a goal or a touchdown in your case, if there's a touchdown, they'll then say, oh, there was a touchdown for such and such a team. And then if the same team gets another touchdown, they'll say there's another touchdown. They're always reporting after the fact. And then if there's 2 or 3 touchdowns, based on that pattern that they've seen, they'll make a prediction that team might win for the so then it's a future prediction. But it's always happening after the fact. And actually, their commentary has no influence over the game whatsoever. And that can be a really powerful recognition that people who are caught in the constant mental commentary, when they realize that things are just going on perfectly well without it, it can be quite startling.
I love that metaphor. As a matter of fact, I had come across it in one of your blog posts, and I had put it on my list of questions to ask you. I'm so glad you got to it. So if I understand then the sheaths, I think the first sheath, as you the order in which you described them to us, I think you called it the body of wisdom. Is that
the first is the body of bliss?
The body of bliss. So is it correct that each additional sheath up the finger that you described is sort of getting a little bit farther away from that body of bliss by adding stuff to it, or is that
it's almost like filters? It's not really getting farther away because there is no distance in our true nature. Distance and time are created in the mind, so there's actually no distance. So we always are our true nature, and we always know our true nature. It's just that, consciousness expresses itself in various ways, and there's various modes of expression. And so the body of bliss or uncaused joy, I think we talked about a little bit in our emails. This is really the threshold of the human experience. Again, to quote sort of Indian philosophy, our true nature is often described in Sanskrit as Sat Chit Ananda. So Sat Chit Ananda translates as truth, consciousness, bliss. And they're really sort of 3 aspects of the same thing, in the same way that water is transparency, liquidity, wetness. So this truth, consciousness, bliss is really a way of trying to describe our true nature, and then bliss is really that threshold then to the human experience. It's the most subtle sheath, if you like. And then the lightest filter, if you like. So there's a slight concession for consciousness to then be this joy, feel itself, know itself as joy, and then through to intuition and effortless flow state, and then into thought, emotion, and the physical body. And you'll see that the energy gets denser and denser as we go through there. So you can think of it as the energy getting denser and denser, or the filters getting sort of darker and darker, if you like. But it's not a question of distance. And so I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's another way of a very good way of pointing people to their true nature, actually, is to point out this collapsing of distance.
Oh yeah, you had a pointing exercise on your website, collapsing distance in awareness. I thought was really excellent.
Yeah, I mean, I can just do that if that's so. If you for 2 seconds.
Yeah.
It's so obviously, as you mentioned there, we can get stuck in distance and time, but it's really easy to show that these things are just created in the mind. So if you take something, I don't know if you guys have got a window or something that you can look out of, or something at a reasonable distance there. You've got a window there, Brian. What can you see out the window?
I can see my plants and I can see other buildings.
Okay, so how far would you say the buildings are from you?
Probably 50 yards is the closest one.
50 yards, okay. So in order to say 50 yards, you have to engage thinking.
Yes.
Yeah. So if you just remain aware and just perceive the buildings without engaging thinking, at what distance do they appear in consciousness?
No distance.
All right. No distance whatsoever.
No, they just appear along with everything else that it just appears in awareness, like the sounds coming.
Yeah. So then ask yourself, how far is it to myself?
Zero distance. I couldn't even
right.
up to myself.
right. So this is actually an interesting way to just show that in order to create distance, we have to engage thinking.
Yes.
Similarly with time. And this is actually the way in which the Buddha was allegedly or apparently enlightened, when he was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and it was a full moon, and the translations vary, but the one translation I read was that, he gazed at the moon and he recognized that the moon and him were one. In other words, there was that realization that there was no distance between his true nature and the moon. They were one and the same. So this is a way of kind of pointing to that.
I love methods like that. And I hear you'll be guiding us in a guided meditation. I'm wondering, is there anything else for you want to say before we go into what effortless being looks like via David Farmer?
No, I think this is a good segment, a good time to do it. Well, we've already talked about the kosha, so I think now that we do the guided meditation, that will really make sense to people.
Sounds good. Let's do it.
Let's do it. So, okay, so both of you just take a little moment to be still and relax, and everybody listening, just wherever you're listening to this, just you're sitting in a chair or standing or in your car, just take a moment to be still and be very aware. And it's actually quite good, this meditation, to have your eyes open. I know a lot of people like to close their eyes, but this one's quite good when we engage all the senses and have all perceptions available. So just be very aware and take a moment to notice any thoughts that might be present. Don't try to engage with them. Don't ignore them. Just notice them. And notice that they arise and dissipate effortlessly. Now, take your attention to your body and notice any sensations in the body. So any aches or pains, or just the sensation of sitting in the chair. Maybe you feel your heart beating. Notice your lungs breathing. And again, notice these sensations arise effortlessly by themselves. Now take your attention to the immediate environment. Notice the light coming in the window. Maybe the sound of my voice. Maybe the hum of a computer, or the buzz of a light bulb. And again, notice that it's all happening effortlessly. And then take your attention to outside of the room or a little further. It might be a sound of a car outside or some birds in the trees. Maybe people talking in another room. And again, notice it's happening effortlessly. Now, if you want to, and this is an option, you don't have to do this, but remaining as this effortless being, you can then engage thinking to make a comment about what is perceived. So you might say, the light is bright, or the tree is green, whatever it might be. And notice that required effort. There was effort involved to engage thinking, but you don't have to do that. Everything is going on perfectly well and effortlessly by itself. So remaining consciously there, stay there as effortless being. And notice the impersonal nature of being. There is no sense of separate self. Also notice there is no suffering in effortless being. Suffering requires thought. If you were to say, I don't like this, that would be suffering itself. So don't engage thinking. Just remain as effortless being. And finally, just notice it requires no effort to simply be.
That's a wonderful meditation. I like how you take us step by step into effortlessness, which shouldn't require step by step, but it often does.
It's just a gentle pointing, isn't it? It's just a gentle pointing to what already is. You know, we already know our true nature, and our true nature is not hidden. It's just constantly overlooked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that alone is one of the greatest pointers, that already here,
Yeah.
because we're all trying to use effort to get something that we think is not here, either to recreate something that we had in the past and we want to experience now, or to get rid of something that's here that we don't like,
Yeah.
and we forget that. And this is why I loved your filters description in the five koshas, because all of that stuff about getting stuff or getting rid of stuff or getting closer are just filters hiding what's already here.
That's right. And it's funny because, you know, it's just really a remembering of what we are. We, you know, when we were newborn, you know, we viewed the world as a singular field of awareness up until around 2 years old. And you know, when you see that's why when you see a newborn baby, you feel peace and contentment. Is that nobody sees a newborn baby and says, "Oh, it's pretty cute, but it will be better once it's enlightened." You know, like nobody says that, right? So you know, the newborn views the world as this singular field of awareness, and then around 2 years old, consciousness starts to play this game of labeling and limitation.
Right.
And that's fine, and that's played for a while, but that entails a lot of suffering. But it's really that, you know, that's why the seeking can last for ages for people, because from 2 they've started to believe they're an individual, separate person. But you know, that awareness was always there. The very fact you can recall, you know, your life stories because you were aware of it. So it's just continually pointing to that which you already are, you know.
There's no Santa Claus.
There is no Santa Claus. That's right.
It was your parents all along.
That's a great metaphor. Yeah. David, how can people learn more about you? I guess at your website, effortlessbeing.org.
Yeah, so I have my website. If anything came up for anybody listening, if that resonated with you, and if you'd like to get in touch with me to talk about anything, you can do so really easily through my website, effortlessbeing.org. You can easily book a session there or send me a message.
You also have a great YouTube channel with lots of terrific videos to see.
Yeah, my YouTube channel is small and still in its infancy, but I really enjoy it. So if anybody would like to pop on there and like, share, and subscribe to the videos, that would be great.
That was wonderful. And people want to support the podcast, they could go to patreon.com/awareness explorers. And I really enjoyed this, David. You have some metaphors and some ways of describing things that really get to the heart of the matter.
Thank you. Yeah, I really enjoyed it. You know, it's really simple, you know, the truth of what we are. It's very simple. And I think moving forward, you know, it's really good to explain things in really simple, clear ways. There's a lot of people get very confused and can be confused for years when it comes to spiritual awakening, but the truth of what we are is very, very simple and very clear, and already is.
Yep. Well, I can't wait for our listeners to hear this, and I think that they will see how simple it is.
Hope so. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Until next time, to our listeners, keep exploring.
Keep exploring.
Thank you for listening to Awareness Explorers. To learn more, you can check out our website at awarenessexplorers.com. Please subscribe to our podcast on your favorite podcast app. We'd love it if you would post a review. And please share our link on Facebook and with family and friends, because knowing yourself as awareness is the greatest gift you can give yourself or someone you love.